Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Green, and I'm excited to talk to you about some of the important topics around AI regulation, governance, ethics, and human algorithm interactions. In particular, I'll focus on the emerging set of policies that require human oversight of algorithms, particularly algorithms used by government agencies, and talk about some of the challenges of where those regulations, although intuitively appealing, fall short. The background of this work is the increasing use of machine learning algorithms by government agencies. On the one hand, many are excited about the opportunities that these algorithms bring to improve the accuracy, fairness, and consistency of decision-making. And this has led to the adoption of algorithms in domains such as pretrial release, child welfare, and public health. Yet despite the optimism motivating government algorithms, the implementation of these tools has been marked by controversies and injustices. Government algorithms are often rife with errors, they discriminate against racial minorities, and fail to provide context-appropriate judgments. These competing hopes and fears about algorithms raises a dilemma for policymakers. How can governments attain benefits from algorithms while avoiding the risks? And across the world, one increasingly common response to this question is to require human oversight of the decisions rendered by algorithms. So I'm talking specifically here about human oversight and intervention in the specific outputs of an algorithmic model. So let me give you a couple examples of what these policies look like. One notable example is the landmark AI Act that the European Commission proposed last spring, which writes, for high-risk AI systems, human oversight is strictly necessary to mitigate the risks to fundamental rights and safety posed by AI. Similarly, a Canadian directive on automated decision-making writes that decisions likely to have high or very high social impacts cannot be made without having specific human intervention points during the decision-making process, and the final decision must be made by a human. So these oversight policies enable governments to use algorithms as long as a human has oversight or control over the final decision. And then the central question that I explored in my research is, what do these policies actually say and how do they work? As part of this research, I looked at 41 different policies around the world that require some form of human oversight as a mechanism for regulating algorithms. So let me dig in a little bit more. So the first question is, what do these human oversight policies actually propose? And we can break down these policies into three different categories. The first approach restricts solely automated decisions. These essentially say that solely automated decisions are prohibited by default, and where allowed, subjects must have the right to human intervention. An example here is the GDPR, which in Article 22 states that the data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing. The second approach is to require human discretion in decision-making. As we can see in the guide for the COMPASS risk assessment algorithm for pretrial and sentencing decisions, North Point, the creator of this algorithm, wrote that staff should be encouraged to use their professional judgment and override the computed risk as appropriate. Essentially here, these policies say that governments may use algorithms as long as human decision makers have discretion to override the algorithm and make the final decision. And the third approach is to require meaningful human input. As the European Article 29 Data Protection Working Party wrote in relation to the GDPR, to qualify as human involvement, the controller must ensure that any oversight of the decision is meaningful rather than just a token gesture. So what this idea of meaningful entails is somewhat vague, but there are three components that are typically required. The first is the ability of the human decision maker to override the algorithm, similarly to the second approach. The second requirement is that the decision maker must be able to understand the algorithm through explanations and transparency. And the third requirement is that the human should avoid relying too heavily on algorithms. They must incorporate other factors and information and values. So the next question to ask is, do these human oversight policies work? They're being implemented around the world as a safeguard against the risks of algorithms. So we really want to understand, how do these policies work, and what lessons can we learn about the construction of AI regulations? And what I argue is that these policies suffer from two fundamental flaws. Let me start with the first flaw, which is that human oversight policies are actually not supported by empirical evidence. It's very intuitively appealing and makes sense that we would want to correct for concerns about algorithmic errors and biases by ensuring that we have a human in the loop of the decision-making process. But there's a great deal of empirical evidence that actually shows that people are not great at performing this type of quality control task. Overall, we find that human discretion into algorithmic decisions does not tend to improve outcomes, even when human oversight moves beyond superficial rubber stamp approaches. Across a wide range of domains, automated decision support systems tend to alter human decision-making in unexpected and often detrimental ways. A notable example of this is the phenomenon of automation bias, where people who are given the aid of automated systems of various sorts tend to decrease the independent scrutiny and judgment that they put on the decision-making task, relying on the automated system to make decisions for them to a large extent. And moreover, people are, as experimental studies from the last several years have shown, people struggle to judge the quality of algorithmic outputs and determine when to override those outputs. Numerous studies have shown that human judgments about when to override algorithms are often incorrect and often inject racial bias into the decision-making process. And this plays out in real-world contexts as well, where judges in the United States have been shown to override pretrial risk assessments in punitive and racially biased ways. And these challenges continue even when we turn to so-called meaningful human oversight. The three components of meaningful human oversight that I described are either unlikely to improve decision-making or are very difficult to achieve. First, people typically override algorithms in detrimental ways, as I just described on the prior slide. Second, explanations and transparency do not tend to improve human oversight. Often these aids increase a person's trust in the algorithm and the algorithm's advice, but is not connected to the actual quality of the system. And finally, it's very hard for people to avoid relying too heavily on algorithms. There's automation bias, as I described, that continues even despite training and recommendations to not rely too heavily on the algorithm. And algorithmic advice can alter how humans are balancing different values and priorities in the decision-making process. So this first flaw then leads to a second flaw where, rather than protecting against the harms of government algorithms, human oversight policies tend to legitimize flawed and unaccountable algorithms in government. And this occurs in two primary ways. The first is that human oversight policies provide a false sense of security in adopting algorithms. These policies make it seem legitimate for governments to deploy algorithms in a wide variety of high-stakes settings, but ultimately, human oversight fails to address the underlying concerns about inaccurate and biased predictions. Second, human oversight diminishes accountability for the institutional decision makers who actually control, develop, and implement these systems. Human oversight policies position frontline human operators as the scapegoats for government algorithms, even though the harms of these systems have been structured by more powerful institutional actors. When something goes wrong, these institutional decision makers can blame the human who was charged with oversight, even if those algorithms should never have been installed in the first place, and if we never should have been expecting the human overseer to actually perform that function. So the question then that we conclude with is, what is the alternative? It's clear that we must stop relying on human oversight as a central mechanism for protecting against the harms of government algorithms. But the answer isn't simply to use algorithms without human oversight or to say that we can never use algorithms at all. We need to develop a different framework. And in my work, I describe the importance of a shift from human oversight as a band-aid to a broader form of institutional oversight, Very briefly, I'll sketch this idea of institutional oversight that operates in two different stages. For an agency that wants to deploy an algorithm in a given setting. First and foremost, the agency would be required to provide proactive justification and evaluation that describes why the algorithm would be beneficial and that any proposed human oversight or collaboration mechanisms have some basis of empirical support. And finally, this process would then require public review and approval before an agency is actually able to adopt an algorithm in practice. And so this process would shift the burden much more heavily onto agencies and vendors to proactively demonstrate that the algorithm will be beneficial and justify the how and why of justify how they are implementing it and regulating it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to conversation with all of you.